I think it's important to me every day when I, write my signature or my name or what I show up for is keeping that intention on the flourishing of humanity and the planet and working on solutions at those intersections.
Welcome to The Regeneration Will Be Funded. My name is Matthew Monahan, and in this series, we're exploring the intersections of regenerative finance, technology, and our living planet. Created with Ma Earth, you can find all of our conversations and more at maearth.com. Thanks for joining us. Welcome. Today's conversation is with my friend Christiana Musk of Flourish Trust. This discussion covered a wide range of topics, and I so appreciate Christiana for openly and vulnerably sharing about her journey. She talks about things like reconciling privilege and inheritance and her own mental health struggles. She also goes into her inquiry around animal-based agriculture, and we go deep on all things food system and how Christiana's research and experience has led to a fairly simple but important framework of the four competing worldviews around our food system and policy. And I think it's such a useful tool for building empathy across different stakeholders when we're having these discussions. We also go into philanthropy, and I'm so excited that Christiana is spending more time in this area. She has so many connections, experiences, and a good lens on finance. So all of that and more. This was recorded in March 2023. I hope you enjoy it. Christiana Musk. Welcome. Today we're here with Christiana Musk. Christiana is the chairwoman of Unreasonable Group and the founder of Flourish Trust. Thanks for being here, Christiana.
Yes, excited to be here and feels like a continuation of our ongoing conversation.
Yes, and Flourish Trust, flourish. Why this word? What does that mean to you?
So I guess what I would say is that throughout my life, I've had many roles and many identities and things that I've worked on. But I would say that the through line is healing, and really healing of ourselves and our culture and our planet. And so whether my role was as an activist, environmental activist, or a co-founder of a company, or maybe people call me a philanthropist now. I sit on the board of a company. I am or a couple companies. I'm a chairwoman of another company. All of these are different roles and identities: mother, researcher, writer, poet, right? But the through line for me has been this healing of ourselves, our culture, and our planet. And it's interesting when I look back to the beginning of my, professional career. I helped start a company called Zods, which meant seed, and that was looking at the seed of potential each of us have within us, and how do we actualize that? And when we're together in community, we were building an online community at that time, but how do we connect all of these people that are trying to activate their seeds and their potential? And now at this stage of my life, I'm thinking about envisioning where we want to be, right? Where is it that we're going? When I look at each of the things I'm working on, whether it's working on the environmental issues or working on mental health issues, I don't like to use these frameworks of mental illness or environmental degradation. I want to talk about what is the world that we want to create. What are we working towards? And so for me, that's one in which we are all flourishing. And that means humans, that means all the beautiful animals on this planet, our societies, our cultures. And I think it's important to me every day when I, write my signature or my name or what I show up for is keeping that intention on the flourishing of humanity and the planet and working on solutions at those intersections.
So I'd love to ask you about this word healing. What does that mean to you?
Healing, I think of, there's the individual context. Now, one would say, like, thinking about healing immediately puts the frame of we're not okay, like we're not okay as we are, or I'm not okay as I am, or but I would say it comes both in the personal context of having struggled with, physical health and psychological health myself, and been on a journey towards healing. But I would also say, when I look around at a lot of the ecological challenges and problems that we have, like, what we need is healing. And so for me, healing is very tied with regeneration, restoration of our individual ecosystems and our communities and our larger ecosystems.
Mm. You mentioned you started somewhat at this as an environmental activist. What was that passion born from, and how did that show up for you?
Yeah, thank you. It started at a really young age. I would say I've always been kind of sensitive to, like, asking very basic questions from the time I was a child, of like, why do people throw trash on the ground, and why is there smog in the air? Why do these things exist? And that adults, grown-ups never had very good answers for these things always bothered me. I'd say when I was about 10 years old, I was so bothered by the smog where I lived that, I was trying to take little sips of air to not breathe it in. And I had built this whole sort of practice of, like, breathing as little as possible to get as little smog in my lungs. And my dad kind of asked me, I think I looked pretty weird, I can imagine, of like taking these tiny sips of air. And he's like, what are you doing? It's like, well, I'm trying not to get the smog in my lungs. And I think that really affected him. And he and I started this inquiry, this journey into, well, where does smog come from? And, like, well, that comes from tailpipes and transportation, but, where else does air pollution come from? And it comes from energy production. And that started me on this journey of understanding to ask these questions of, like, where does this come from and why does it happen? And in my younger years, that was a journey I was taking with my father. And he was later in his career, and together we kind of inspired each other back and forth. And he started a clean energy company called Green Mountain Energy that I got to be a part of from the very beginning, and get to see how someone can try to start a company to be a solution to environmental challenges that we see. And we had this vision at this time that we would be able to get consumers to choose clean air and electricity all over the country, and that we believed if people were given a choice, they would choose clean over dirty and renewable energy over coal-fired power plants. And then that consumer choice would drive, like, a revolution. It turned out we were only able to offer people the choice in a few different states, so it was a lot slower than we imagined. But by the time we sold the company in 2011, we had created power purchase agreements for about 40 wind and solar facilities. And, my family being entrepreneurial, my family being part of this, success story of modern capitalism, at one point, I felt like very much like me and my family were to blame for a lot of the world's problems, or a lot of the environmental problems. And I went out on a quest. This is a long answer, so you can stop me anytime.
Beautiful.
So I went out, actually, young mom, daughter in my backpack. And I went to live on a lot of intentional communities, specifically that were trying to work on living in harmony and relationship with the planet. And in being there, I learned permaculture, I learned sustainable and natural building. Before going out on this quest, had given away a lot of my, as many of my belongings and luxury things as I could, and was trying to wear all hemp and all natural clothing and be, as like everybody else as I could be, and learn all of these wonderful tools and synergies. And I remember at one point it hit me that it was a real privilege that I didn't have to work and earn an income, and got to spend my time in service of these communities, but on the other hand, I also knew that ultimately was kind of an imposter in them. I felt like an imposter in trying to give all my money away. Turns out people structure like trusts where you can't actually do that as like a young person. So I was kind of stuck with this someday inheritance, but no control over actually any money, and feeling this guilt around this. And I started to want to think about how could I take everything that I was learning from these intentional communities and everything that was working, because there was a lot that was also not working in those communities that were I never quite found my place in them, let's say. But I tried to think about how could this grow beyond these niche communities. Like I felt like I would put all this energy in service and I wanted it to be a model for the world. But then I would look outside the world and think, gosh, like I look at Green Mountain Energy, like our family's company, and it was able to, it kept growing with how many renewable energy plants it was able to help create, like how many wind farms and how many solar. And I couldn't quite reject the effectiveness of those systems to be able to create renewable energy for more than just my community.
Right.
And there was this desire in me, like if I want healthy food for my child, and if I want her to have clean air, and if I want that for this community, now I want that for all children of this planet, and not just now, but for all time. And that put me in this question of scale. And it put me in the question of systems change. And it put me in the question of like, how do we get people to understand, like to connect the dots in the way that people do in these communities, but spread it farther across the planet and to connect to one another, so that we can really be a groundswell of change. And that fulcrum in my life moved me also from feeling like it was my individual job to stop breathing and to stop taking up space and to try, there's still the intention not to cause harm, and there's still the intention that everything I do to be good, but it's also like so much bigger than this individual organism, right? And so how can I connect with others with these same intentions so that this movement is much bigger than my individual footprint, right?
Just got chills.
Yeah.
And so how did that lead to food?
Yeah. So I'd say that when I was young and was thinking about the air that we breathe, I was thinking about transportation. I was thinking about energy. Never did it occur to me to actually even ask the question, where does my food come from? How is it produced? Who grows it? And when I was struggling with my psychological health in my 20s, I think one of the ways in which that manifested was to disconnect from my body, to disconnect from my food, to dissociate from that entirely. And as part of that, I got to be about 260 pounds. So that's about double the body weight that I am now. And, it was quite an interesting path, to be a young, healthy, able-bodied person and to move through the world that way, versus being a 260-pound, obese person moving through the world, because people relate to you very differently. My body was not as able, so I was not able to get up and down the stairs. Back to breath, very difficult to breathe, to get up and down the stairs. And I wouldn't say that I ever during those times connected what I was eating to its impact on my body or to the planet or to the farmers that grew it. And when I went through the process, so I was very fortunate to have a daughter when I was only 20, my greatest teacher. And, at the time, a lot of people maybe thought it wasn't the best idea, but it definitely was the best idea. But this being pregnant actually put me in care and in service of something larger than myself and my own body, and actually made me make the connection to thinking about, what I'm eating and what I'm putting in my body is really important for her nourishment. And so therefore I must nourish myself to take care of her. And then when she was born, I started thinking about, putting food in her mouth. And there's these around 4 months old, they start taking their first bites. And so, for her, I just wanted every, you just want for your child, every bite to be just to foster their growth and their health and their nourishment. And so I started to ask these questions about, well, where does this apple come from? And where does this cheese come from? And, as I started to follow those threads back, I realized that our food system is not sustainable, and it's not healthy, and it's not fair. And, in wanting my child to have food that is produced, that is healthy, and that is produced sustainable, and that is, how could I want a world in which other people suffer so that she could be nourished? How is that nourishment, right? It really led me on the quest just to find that food for her, and then to want that for all children. And then, reciprocally, in trying to feed that to her, I also started to really nourish my body. And from the time she was born, I think it was about 10 months, and I lost 130 pounds pretty quickly through, learning how to be in connection and in relationship with food that's nourishing for me and my child and the planet.
That's not like a fad diet program or a new exercise routine. That's a consciousness shift. And yeah, I'm just curious, what was that experience like?
Yeah, was not a fad diet. I think it was a consciousness shift, and it's an identity shift as well. To say, if I have the capacity to be able-bodied and to be out in the world and to be enjoying this precious life with this child, I'm going to choose to do so. And as part of that, that was bringing my body in alignment with the life that I wanted to live.
So for people who may not have as much familiarity with food policy and the food system, at a high level, I'm curious, what have you learned in your work there, and what are some of the key insights?
Yeah. So when we think about how our food grows and where it grows and who grows what, I think it's really helpful to think about it in this evolutionary arc, right? That we've moved from foragers and hunters and gatherers to being horticulturists, to being early grain agriculturalists, to moving into an era of colonialism in which we're not just growing the foods that are native to the land where we are. I'd say there's probably this whole period around, agriculture where there's a lot of expansionism, as well, of we don't have enough food we're growing here, we're going to invade this town and take their food as well. So, and then the colonialism was an expansion of that. We're going to go to new lands and take their food as well, and ways of growing food and species, and incorporate that into our agriculture. And then we had this threshold of moving into an industrial way of growing food. And that's the system we're inheriting now. And when you look at it, this whole evolutionary arc, there's an interesting theory about food regime theory, that one regime displaces the next one. And it's really a concept in food policy, but it's a constellation of actors, right, that all agree upon a set of economics and a set of principles and a set of value exchange. And that creates the system around it and how the rules of the game are played. And then there becomes a group that disagrees with it and decides to create new language around disliking the former system, and and then creating new language around what the new system is going to be. And so what I would say is that from I'd say that the time periods of each of these different systems are shortening as we evolve, because there's a faster period of innovation exchange. The more that people are less spread out on different continents and more clustered in deep continent, on the same continents, and then they're more, the exchange that's now happening through the internet and ways of sharing knowledge. Innovation in food and farming is very much about knowledge sharing, and so I'd say, the paradigm maybe you and I are around the same age have inherited is that industrial food is the problem, and my father's generation would say, like, industrial food was the solution. It was the solution to world hunger. And actually, that's a whole paradigm of productionism, which we must produce as much food as possible to feed the world. That made a lot of sense when the majority of humanity lived where they had in food scarcity and they didn't have enough access to food and nutrients to guarantee their children's survival. And in the world in which my father was born in the 1930s, in the Great Depression, post-Dust Bowl, that was the industrial system saved people from starvation. And it enabled us to create this truly abundant food system. And that was about mechanizing, that was about industrializing, that was about using hybrid, genetics of plants and animals to be able to produce more food. Now, the produce more food thing, we I think it was about the 1970s that we passed that, and we passed it with flying colors, and we just kept going. And all of our food policies are just still on produce more food and produce more food. And that still needs to happen in a lot of parts in the world where, there still need to be much more intelligent and informed ways of producing more food. But we've gotten our policies locked in to a goal that we've evolved beyond. And so now we're in a situation where, I'll just take the US, for example, although you cannot think about food systems as just one country because food systems are global. And, when you try to shape food policies for one system, you've got to be thinking about constant trade. Everything we eat comes from everywhere in the world. We now are in this place in the US where we produce so much corn that we have to burn it to be able to control the price of corn. And so when people say ethanol doesn't make sense because it's 1 unit of energy put in to burn 1 unit of energy, like, what is this whole exercise about? It's about controlling the price of corn because we produce too much, right? And so now the question is, what replaces productionism? And I think that we are at a really interesting time in history when we're starting to understand our relationship with the plants and animals around us much better than we ever did. The modern study of ecology really only came about in the 1960s. So we're now understanding how what we grow our food impacts the planet. We're now understanding how what impacts people in other parts of the planet and in our own country that are growing our food. A farmer is able to get on an iPhone in Iowa and able to get an iPhone in Kenya and tell you, this is what's happening on my farm. These are the kinds of policies that are polluting my waterways. These are the kinds of things that are depleting my soil. And no longer are we able to not listen and not see. And so the question is, how do we create a food system that nourishes humanity adequately, equitably, and sustainably?
Wow. I love this frame of the evolutionary context and where we are coming in this kind of post-industrial, high emphasis on production. And so when you think out with the work you're doing with Flourish Ventures and all of the different projects, what more specifically beyond adequately and equitably and sustainably are we trying to achieve here?
Yeah, well, I think this points to, what does the word sustainable mean, right? Is that if we just sustain current practices, we're basically going to need a whole nother planet to be able to produce the amount of food that we produce. So, we need to start thinking. We don't have the luxury of just saying, let's just keep things going as they're going. We now need the next evolution of our food system to also be regenerative and to be replenishing. And so we need to be regenerating and restoring our ecosystems and our soil, or we're not going to be able to sustain life as we know it on this planet. And it's that drastic. It's that urgent. It's not something we have the luxury to put off in time. And yet we're still learning how to do that. It's not something that we have prioritized, I would say, in civilized society, or like modern civilization. And so it's something we're needing to learn from a lot of the populations that have been able to live in relationship with their planet and live in relationship with their food sourcing and production for many thousands of years. And so it's a time of listening and a lot less arrogance for a lot of people that's been in charge of our food system to learn about how to nourish ourselves in interrelationship with our planet.
Okay, so you mentioned ending food waste. You mentioned the importance of soil. You mentioned different characteristics of the food system. One thing I know you've worked on, and I'm super curious how you think about these days, is meat and animal agriculture.
Yes. So we cannot create a food system which nourishes all of humanity adequately, equitably, and sustainably if we don't tackle the big, elephant in the room or the cow in the room, right? And one of the reasons why this has been such a difficult topic to address sustainably is that meat is something that is so precious to us. As a human species, 95% of all humans eat some form of meat. And so it's a difficult thing to talk about in the context of sustainability. But one of the reasons why we need to do that, or an easy way to kind of think about it, is that all of us, animals, human animals, plants, we're all embodied energy of some sort, right? Like we take energy from the sun and from the resources around us, and we concentrate it in our organism. And so the larger these food animals are, livestock animals are, then the more embodied energy that they have, the more embodied nature. So not just sun energy, but also the more plants that are in them, that are embodied in these animals, the more water that's embodied in the animals, and then often, not always, but more labor as well, especially if an animal is being tended to and it takes more time, right? And so, like when we look at it, we have about 8 billion people on the planet now. And to feed 8 billion people, 95% of whom are consuming meat, it's about 70 billion land-based animals a year. And so that requires about 2/3, or let's say 1/3 of the ice-free surface of this earth, and 75% of all agricultural land is dedicated to livestock production. And our food system in general is, from all the foods we produce, has a big climate impact, and livestock have a drastically more significant climate impact. And also pollution for a lot of the ways in which we're producing feed for these animals. And so the question of, there's not a question anymore there's not a question in the meat industry. There's not a question from farmers. There's no question that we can't continue to produce food animals in the same way that we always have. Something has to change. And we're at a time where we're arguing a lot about what needs to change and how do we change it. And I think that this sits within the larger conversation of what is this next era of our food system, and what are we evolving to. But basically, in my, I want to say first in my activism and then in my research, I was bumping up against big debates about this. First debates about the data, about this fact is wrong and that fact is wrong. Well, I'm going to get better facts and I'm going to get better facts. And, I was deep in this argument of like, I'm going to have the best research and the best statistics, and I'm going to get up on stage and I'm going to educate people, and people are going to, really just hear all of this information and then completely change their eating habits, and we're going to have a sustainable planet. But then, I'd be on the world stage somewhere really important, like the United Nations, or somewhere like the dietary guidelines hearings at the USDA and at the FDA. And these are things that shape our international climate policy and shape our dietary guideline policy, which affects $16 billion of federal procurement. And there'd be somebody else on the stage arguing completely different facts and statistics. And, usually 2 or 3 people with completely different worldviews and paradigms at which they were looking at this data and the stories that they were telling about meat and its role in our diet for health and for sustainability. And it basically, I realized that we were doing no service to the people around us, to any of the policymakers that were trying to make decisions, to any of the people that are trying to, mothers trying to make decisions for their families, trying to do good things for their health and for their family's health. And so I basically kind of threw in the towel and on the activism and went to work on research. And what I did for my research is I looked at public speeches of initially thousands, but narrowing it down to hundreds, and then a sample set of public speeches on experts in meat and sustainability. So these are people that are out there, on the circuit in the English-speaking language. And I look for what are common patterns in how they're framing the problem, how they're framing the solution, and what they think that we should do about this, and where they're getting their evidence from. And when I did that, it was intentionally to not have a view, to not come at it with an agenda, but just say, what's the broad sweep of who thinks we should do what? And how do I try to find common clusters? And what I found is it wasn't actually like a binary. It wasn't like these 2 sides of meat versus plants, or more versus less, or organic versus industrial, like I thought it was. In fact, there were 4 different worldviews that I identified. And to kind of simplify it, I'll call them the improvers, who think we need to continue to meet demand for animal-sourced foods, and we need to do so as efficiently as possible. And so we need to improve the genetics of livestock. We need to reduce our carbon footprint. We need to capture the carbon. And so basically, in this future of food with the improvers, we have, massive solar-powered, genetically altered poultry farms all over the planet, capturing the waste and funded by carbon credits. And, the UN and all the development agencies are on board. So this is one way.
That's the improver way.
This is the way to improve, without trying to change our consumption patterns and without trying to introduce any kind of disruptive or radical kind of technology. We're just slowly going to keep genetically altering the genetics of these animals to make them more efficient. And we're going to slowly keep changing our, and just keep on this journey of continuous improvement. And the reason for poultry is it has a lower feed efficiency ratio. So we need smaller animals, right? So then we have, after the improvers, and I would say, like we said, it's a constellation of people that make these agreements. You can't just say that's the industry. That's also like a policy paradigm. There's also activist paradigms. There's also philanthropists. Like there's a whole community of engagement around this worldview of improvers. Then I would say is the people that take that complete opposite pole of like, wait, we produce enough food to feed 10 billion people today. Why would we just increase production? In fact, all we need to do is reduce consumption of animal-sourced foods. Easy. If people just reduce their meat consumption, or let's say switch out their meat proteins for plant proteins today, we'll just have an abundance of protein to feed everybody. And so in this future, you want to have a lot of plant-based proteins that can feed a lot of people. And you want to focus on trying to increase access to plant-based foods and the kinds of policies that can help people reduce their consumption. And that is also there's important policies and movements, things like Meatless Mondays that are trying to take one day of meat out of our diet at schools, all the way to people trying to advocate for eliminating meat out of the diet entirely. And so what these people really believe in that's different from the improvers is that they believe in people's abilities and social systems' abilities to shift eating patterns and to shift human behavior. Whereas improvers, they don't believe that anyone will change their behavior. So we have to produce more. So you have a real difference in the belief in humanity's ability to change their eating patterns or not.
And what's that second group called?
They're called the reducers.
The reducers, yes. So
The improvers-
reduce meat consumption. Let's swap it out for more plants, and that will fundamentally change things.
Yes, simple.
And then what about the third group?
So the third group are the regenerators. And so the regenerators, where I would say that the improvers and the reducers actually share quite a lot of their, let's say reductionistic models of carbon accounting and science. They'll say, well, the feed efficiency ratio is looking pretty good with chicken versus pork, but what if you compare chicken to tofu? And what if you compare tofu to lentils? Once you get to lentils, the feed efficiency ratio is, pretty good for what you put in when you're accounting for carbon. What happens with regenerators is that they're coming from a completely different paradigm where they're saying, okay, well, our goal is actually to look at how do we regenerate the land that sustains us, and what is the role that livestock have played traditionally on this planet, and how have humans and animals interrelated with one another and this planet over time, and how do we model our meat production after that? And so actually, where you'll find the language is completely different, where an animal is referred to as a unit of production in the first system, in the improver system. The reducers will talk about the unit of protein. And then the regenerators will talk about the ruminants. So they'll talk about the role, the animal in its role in an ecosystem. And so that is it. And the other thing is that they're measuring their ecosystem metrics completely differently, because they're wanting to look at the health of the whole system in interrelationship with one another. So they're looking for biodiversity indicators, and they're looking for biodiversity, I'd say, like in the soil. So like, how many different species of microorganisms do we have in the soil? How many different species of mycelium do we have in the soil? Like, how many different species of birds do we have flying around here? Like, looking for the presence of beneficial species in the water sources. Like, these are all indicators of the health of an ecosystem. Whereas the, reducers and improvers would say, like, there's not enough research for that, because, like, how can you demonstrate your carbon reductions? There's an urgency, there's climate change. The improvers can demonstrate their carbon reductions pretty easily because they can measure so well, and then they can demonstrate their reductions, and then they can be paid for that. Right? They can be incentivized to do that. They can be on ESG reports, right? Where somebody says, I want to be in an ESG fund. Well, great. Look at the carbon reductions of these producers, right? And same thing for plant-based foods. They're like, well, look at our carbon reduction. And same thing, beneficially, if like a company has big procurement and they shift to plant-based production, that's great. They're demonstrating real reduction in their carbon footprint. And right now, the regenerators are now making their case for ecosystem health, and we're still learning, like, how do we account for this? How do we account for it over time? How do we value this in our scientific paradigms? And how do we value it in our economic paradigms, right?
And would this be where kind of the regenerative agriculture movement mostly fits?
Yeah, no, absolutely. The regenerative agriculture movement absolutely fits within this paradigm. And, or I would say, I hate to say fits within or they're in boxes or any of these things, because, ultimately if we want to look at some of my diagrams, it's all on a spectrum. It's just easier to kind of give names to the clusters of groups, and any individual can kind of land anywhere on the spectrum or can have, a different perspective. So I don't want to say I'm putting people in buckets, but I'd say that this is a way of thinking that the regenerative agriculture movement is really trying to help policymakers think about, trying to help investors think about, trying to help, consumers, I hate that word consumers, let's say eaters, trying to help farmers understand, the productionist paradigm has this division between producers. They call farmers producers and consumers are consumers. And, I think when, this, whatever our next evolution of our food system, I hope we start to think of ourselves as, there's going to be a better word that someone will come up with, maybe you will, but it's about cyclers of nutrients. Not that this is like a dead end, like I consumed and this ended, but like I'm participating in cycling these nutrients until my body goes back into the planet and becomes, returns to its carbon cycle.
So amazing. We have the improvers, the reducers, the regenerators, and what's the fourth bucket?
Oh, the disruptors. Nice. Yes. So the disruptors are looking at livestock completely differently. So if you look at, and I was mapping the language of lots of these folks, the disruptors will say things like, let's look at livestock as an antiquated technology for producing protein for humans. And so basically, like they look at livestock as something that's domesticated from a wild animal. Like a cow is not a wild animal. It's something that humans trained the genetics over thousands of years to be able to produce food. Its primary job, a domesticated animal, is to produce food for humans, right? And in the human systems. And so they say, well, okay, so we spent 6,000 to 8,000 years thinking that was the best way that we could produce meat for humans. But now let's bypass that. We can actually take animal cells and put it in a bioreactor, and we can mimic everything that's happening inside of a cow. And then we can produce meat without having to go through the whole nervous system of the animal, without the animal having to live its entire life in enslavement to the goals of human meat consumption. I know that's a strong word, but essentially, these animals are not, for the most part, living an animal life. They're living a unit of production life, right? Especially when you get to, all animals, but especially when you get to poultry, we've gone so far in genetically altering them and so far in their caged existence that maybe we should look at, if we're just trying to get that breast tissue, why don't we bypass the whole animal life and just create that tissue itself? And I would also add in this paradigm, like a lot of the forward-thinking plant-based meats, which are a little bit different from traditional plant-based sources of foods. So like the Impossible Burgers and the Beyond Meat burgers, and the reason why I don't make it only meat is I actually think what's happening right now is that we're going to have mycelial-based meats. We're going to have meat made from CO2 sequestered from the atmosphere. We're going to have algae-based meat. We're going to have seaweed-based meat. And all of these folks are using a lot of the best of the technology we have to try to make meat. So I would really call it man-made meat. And the cell-based meat is really different than the plant-based meat, so the mycelial-based meats. So I think the disruptors share a paradigm of thinking and their way of promoting these products. And it's interesting where you look at their worldview from they're sort of sitting in between the improvers and the reducers too, because they're saying, yes, we're going to continue. We also believe that humans are not going to change their behavior. So we need to make as much meat as people want to eat. But we're going to make it from plant-based or cell-based inputs and bypass that. And so one way that you would think about it is that the regenerators are thinking in terms of land sharing for sustainability, and the disruptors are really thinking about land sparing. The improvers are too. Actually, the whole reason they're trying to concentrate production, they would argue now that leaves more room for nature if we just concentrate the footprint that animals are produced on. And they've done that. They've reduced, they're called landless systems, which ironically require so much land for the feed. It's like, they say oceans of feed goes into feed islands, islands of animals, so concentrated animal production. But my point is each of these four paradigms actually all have sustainability agendas and all have different metrics for what success looks like and sustainability. It's not that there's the good guys and the bad guys. They actually, what I argue for, which we can get to in a second, but what I argue for is to deeply understand each of these worldviews, and to deeply, educate ourselves about each of them so that we can make important choices as policymakers and as eaters and as activists about what are we standing for and what are we advocating for and why.
Yeah, I love that. These principles of listening and understanding as a way to depolarize what sometimes these conversations can turn into, and to try to bring a holistic lens into this next food system that we're evolving into. And I love the simplicity, of taking so many different competing ideas and worldviews, and at least offering a framework, and obviously not trying to make it all neat and tidy where everyone fits into a box, but just getting to the underpinnings of maybe some of the motivations and paradigms that you're seeing in this broader sets of contexts. Okay, so we talked about the improvers, the reducers, the regenerators, and the disruptors. And I'm curious on that last piece. We now see an increasing role of technology. And a lot of people, including myself, get scared when they hear about lab-based meats and, synthesized chicken tissues. And so where do you see these worlds colliding, and how do you think about it?
Yeah, I would agree with you that before I spent a lot of time with the people behind, basically, I went in order to study all of these different worldviews. I said I looked at a bunch of public speeches and mapped it. Like, yes, that's my research methodology, but really, I immersed myself in each of these worldviews, and I went to the places where they meet and where they constellate and where people come together. And so it did occur to me that as many years as an advocate for reducing meat consumption and blaming the villain of the meat industry, I had never been inside a slaughterhouse. I had never met anyone other than being positioned against them on stage that worked inside the meat industry, that worked with and for them. And yet that system was winning. It won in international policy, it won in domestic policy. So the question for me was like, what is it about before I had the language improvers, what is it about the improvers that enables them to continue to dominate, shaping our policy and providing most of the food that's available most of the world? And the answer for me on that, I'll say what I did is I started to spend time with the improvers. So I went to meat industry gatherings and events. I was invited inside slaughterhouses. I went to farms. I went to ranches. I spent time with people. I asked them questions. They were incredibly gracious. They were incredibly gracious at helping me understand how important it is to them to get people food at affordable prices. So they win because of the adequately, accessibly, affordably, like most people in the world in our current economics cannot afford any of those other options right now. And that became very real for me, where are we locked in a situation where that the way that we produce meat that is so harmful to the planet and so harmful to the animals. I don't want to, speak about all of these systems. There's better and better ones, but that's the only possible option if we want to get protein to people affordably. Like, really, is that true? And that really led me to spending much more time with the disruptors, because they are really trying to feed the world meat at affordable prices. And it won't be, as with any new technology, it won't be immediately at accessible and affordable prices, because they have to build up the distribution. But initially, where I was kind of like irked by it, let's talk about the cell-based in particular, I really had to think I was one of the first maybe 50 people in this world to eat cell-based meat. And it sat on the end of my fork for a good extra minute or two. And I thought a lot about it.
I'm imagining what you mentioned about the food on the fork to feeding your daughter, and now you're right back into that moment. Yeah.
Absolutely. And also, like a large part of it is I had actually been in graduate school, and I was researching why people accept, what are the social attitudes to new food technologies, especially in meat? Why are people neophobic? I was studying everything about this. And it's one thing to be like writing a research report on it. It's something else to have that right in front of you and to smell it and look at the, the texture and the smell and the feeling of it. And the thing that I realized as I got closer to it is, and I did put it in my mouth and I did chew it and I did taste it, was I didn't just like it, I loved it. I loved it. And this is full transparency, like walk through the lab and see how the tissue is grown. And
Wow.
I mean, it's more transparent than even when I walk through the slaughterhouses, there's certain parts of the system they don't want to show you, right? And I got to be fully transparent with every aspect of this production system and the people that are behind it. And I ate it and it tastes and smells to me better than the meat, because one of the problems I've always had with meat from an animal is the texture, the ligaments, the veins, the bones, all of the animalness has always been really hard for me to be really present with. And this was all the meat smells and tastes and yumminess without any of the veins and like viscera and things. So, to the argument of how is this not the new margarine though? Like, we thought margarine was great. Turned out butter's better for you than this. I think they said some forms of margarine were even plastic, like in other forms, very processed foods and not good for our arteries. But I think it's really important with new food technologies to continue to test them and to continue to look at what the impact is in our body and our, internal ecosystem. I wouldn't say that it's like an automatic pilot, safe. It's now FDA approved. So that's a first step. And it shouldn't be either under or overestimated what that means. Like it shouldn't be underestimated, because it's quite a lot to get to the stage of being not just a new biotechnology, but like a new entire category of biotechnology. But also lots of things are FDA approved that are not very good for our health. Right. What I found, so like I basically plotted these worldviews I found they could be plotted on dual axis. Production to consumption is one, and technological versus ecological on the other. And so, most people that are advocating for the more ecologically oriented and agroecologically oriented solutions are in direct opposition to those things that are more technological, and in fact blame all of our problems for technology in the food system to begin with. But there's some level of technology in all agriculture. Sure. There has to be, because otherwise it would just be nature and we would just forage it. But there's always, for at least 10,000 years, we've trained nature to optimize for producing food for humans. But it's really a spectrum, of how much technology anyone has an appetite for and how to disclose that to people so that they can make conscious choices. Right now, we have genetically modified salmon that's in our food system, and that's the first animal that's genetically modified. No one seemed to really mind. There are GMO advocates who are very against it, but how much have you heard about it? Like, not very much. Like, people actually, I'd say the general public seem to be somewhat okay with biotechnology in the food system. And that could be because they're uninformed, or it could be because it doesn't bother them. You could ask a lot of questions about that. I'd say, the technological worldview says that if we want scale and if we want accessibility and if we want affordability, then we're going to need to utilize the best of what we have in technology to spare nature, to not have such a big land footprint dedicated to human consumption. And my personal perspective after all of this is that I do think that the ecological or the agroecological and the technological are the right hand and left hand of systems change. The question with both is, what are the values that are informing them? And we can have a very dangerous food system dominated by, values that don't take into account adequately and equitably and sustainably nourishing humanity, or we can have those leaders of our technological systems working towards those goals. And I would say the same thing for the agroecological, because sometimes those working in the agroecological systems are like, this is for me and my tribe. This is, we really should only have 2 billion people on this planet. So the other 6 billion people better take a hike, or that's either explicit or it's implicit or not spoken about. And it can be, there can be a lot of elitism, and it can be very expensive. And yet, if you have someone looking at agroecological regenerative systems and saying accessibility and meaning all of humanity deserves to have these systems, and I'm going to dedicate my life and time and policy energy to making sure all of humanity can access these regenerative systems, then it looks like a very different food system. And it's a lot more distributed production, and a lot of policies need to change to be in favor of that. And right now, all of our policies are in favor of the improvers model. So it is a real decision for people in either direction. Like, the disruptors system fits better. all of these systems have synergies, right? All of these worldviews have places where they overlap. And that's where the traction is. But really, it comes down, in my opinion, to people who are holding an ecological consciousness that's inclusive of well-being of people and planet and animals, that are directing the policies for these systems and building the businesses for these systems.
Right. I think what comes up for me is like, we talked about, not examining that relationship with our food. And I had the same journey. I didn't ever think to ask the question of where does my food come from for many years of my life. And so how do we create a world and a system where where there's a connection? And I worry that if we just continue down this kind of clever mechanization and tool making that we seem to be so good at as a species, that we're going to continue to get further and further disconnected. So that would be kind of one thing that comes to me. And then the other is just this, you mentioned the production paradigm overshooting, and like, okay, well, since the 70s, we don't even need to produce much food. We need to think more about the limits and the waste and, the relocalization of food systems to be in better place. And the tools seem to continue to grow exponentially without our consciousness catching up to it, right? Yeah. And so how do we nurture systems that are also in consideration and optimizing for what is this consciousness for each subsequent generation really going to look like? And so, yeah, I guess that somewhat beyond just, I don't know if I can get over the fork going into the mouth of the lab-based chicken breast.
Squeamishness,
right? Which I still haven't crossed that threshold yet. But it's more about, that we're going to be so clever, but we're not going to be wise. And I'm curious how you think about that overall consciousness, and how do we balance all of these things? You mentioned listening. You mentioned really, understanding different worldviews. Are there other things that have come through your work and research about how do we try to, improve the whole?
Yeah. What I hear from you is about how important it is to be in relationship with the provenance of our food and with those people and with those ecological systems that are generating the food, and how so much of what we're striving for is that reconnection. So, is this going to bring us into some dystopian, disconnected future that we don't want? And I think that the reality is that only so many people can dedicate their full time to growing all of their food, right? And so sometimes there's a romance about growing all of our own food, sure, right? Which is not possible.
I tried that. The reality smashed me in the face.
Yeah. So then you're like, well, they grow something pretty good. So maybe I at one point had my own little permaculture set up on my own property, and then, met this amazing biodynamic farmer a biodynamic farmer up the road and turned all my land to low water consuming succulents pretty much.
Totally.
And instead was
Yeah.
like, let me volunteer for you and also buy food from you because it's also less expensive than running my whole farm.
Right.
And I'm supporting you who are a true genius in these systems. And so then you get into the division of labor and we're back at capitalism. But the question is like, we know that our mental health and well-being and our physical health and what we choose to eat benefits from more time that we spend gardening and the more time we spend on farms and in nature. So to some degree, it's really beneficial for that to be part of all of our education and all of our capacity to know and understand how to work with plants and how growing the life cycle of plants and the life cycle of animals. I think that's incredibly important, whether it's through ecological learnings and spending time in those systems or agroecological, right? So food systems that are mimicking those ecological patterns. I think that's important. That being said, I look at our population and where most people spend most of their time and how many people are really working all day just to afford food. And we still want them to have education and we still want them to have access to everything. But I have been just had it drilled into me like, price, and nutrition for price, right? And like, how do we get that for people? And even if, I guess the thing is that you don't have to pick a menu based on the paradigm. The thing is that there are multiple co-occurring futures at any given time. Like right now, there's someone existing in a hunting and foraging way of life. There are some people that just hunt and forage on the weekends. There are some people that only ride horses for transportation. There are other people that ride horses on the weekends, right? So like where we're evolving to, I think absolutely will incorporate the best of these technologies. And it may be that people reject the cell-based meat and then it's mycelial-based meat or it's pea protein-based meats or these things, but there's no doubt that we're going to have some kind of replacements for the way that our meat is grown today. Or, I mean, if it became totally like, let's say you had to choose one or the other, if it was a fully agroecological meat production model, then we're going to have to come to terms with less, right? And then how do we do that in a way where it's not like some people get to eat this agroecological food, the meat, let's say regenerative meat, and other people don't get meat at all because it becomes a class issue and an affordability issue. And when it came down to my personal ethics, that's not okay for me.
Yeah, well said. Okay, so we've kind of gone through the journey from environmental activism to food systems, and now a lot of this work is expressing itself through your philanthropy. And so, yeah, what's alive there, and how are you thinking about the levers of influence and change in the philanthropic space, and any observations you're having?
Sure. So, ultimately, with philanthropy, we ideally try to supplement that in society, which isn't being served by government or by business and markets. And so for us, that's been a lot about food justice and equity and access and real food education. And I think you'll have my husband on this show, so he'll hopefully go into much more depth than I could about the food justice work that he's leading for us. For me, I've been, after working on all the polarizing issues of meat, I continue to actually support in lots of ways this food system change. To me, as polarizing as meat issues have been, I learned that food waste isn't. There's no lobby.
I'll agree on that.
Yeah, no lobby that's like really trying to make sure we keep wasting food.
Yeah.
And so there's been a lot of work I've been doing also through impact investing in great entrepreneurs that are working to solve food waste. And so finding solutions where, a lot of food is wasted at the farm level because either the price changes and so they can't afford to harvest the food, or, the demand changes, all kinds of things. And so food that is grown and all the labor and all the energy and all the water that goes into that just go straight to the landfill, where then it off gases methane. So it's a major climate problem. And so basically, if food waste globally, if the emissions from a food waste were attributable to a country, it would be the third largest emitter in the world. So from a climate perspective, food waste seemed to me like a really important solve.
Yeah.
But also there's an amazing organization called FarmLink, which is taking food from farmers and just because they can't afford to harvest it, getting volunteers to harvest it, and then feeding it to food banks. And so it's directly fresh fruits and vegetables are being fed to people. And then the farmer gets the tax deduction, right? And they're working in almost every state in America, I think every state in America and also Mexico. So to me, like that is a win-win. And then there's also, different business solutions for this too. There's a company called Gooder and an entrepreneur named Jasmine Crow, who's one of our Unreasonable Fellows. And she's figured out that airports are throwing away edible food every day and big stadiums are throwing away food every day. And if she could just get this food to people that are hungry and in need, then also the companies can get the tax deduction and she can get people fresh, sustaining meals. And so and then I think there's really important, once you have solutions like these, there's really good policy solutions that can happen after that. And if we can pilot them locally and if we can pilot them federally, then we can, help do these worldwide. So I'd say food waste is a big one for us, on top of the food justice. And to me, food waste is also a food justice issue, also a hunger and nutrition and synergy between health and sustainability.
It's interesting. A lot of what we've been exploring in this interview series so far is a lot around Web3 and the intersection with ecological regenerative coordination. And it strikes me that food waste, I haven't come across, and please let me know if someone's working on it, but I haven't come across, but it does seem like the intersection of Web3 and coordination for food waste could be really interesting because these are somewhat systems that are broken because of all of the different actors are just answerable to their own particular incentives, and the stadium doesn't have an incentive yet to somehow divert the food waste into a more distributed network, or and so connecting all these up using digital tools and DAOs and tokens or whatever. I'm sure there's an interesting surface area there, which is a slight tangent from what you're describing.
This is a great idea. Put it out in the
hopefully
ecosystem, and somebody will pick up on this.
So I'm sure someone's already doing it.
We need this. Let me know if it exists.
Yes, good. Email your pitch deck to Christiana.
Right.
Yeah, absolutely. So are there other things that you're doing and seeing at Unreasonable and in the philanthropic space? And I'm also curious, if you can talk a bit more about Unreasonable and where you draw the line between for-profit investment, nonprofit, blended finance. Like, what's your approach?
Yeah, I mean, I guess just like I said, I've always been an activist and I just put on different hats.
Right.
It's also a question of which form of capital is in greatest service of the goal and the structure of what's wanting to be done. And a lot of times nonprofits are doing things that just don't work as business models. And if there is a business model for it, and that works better, then, capital can be provided there. What I'm really passionate about is, there's a lot of philanthropic capital that sits in foundations, in endowments, in donor advised funds that's not getting unlocked. And so the question is how to have a robust portfolio that's entirely aligned with the social and environmental impact. I mean, for me, that's food systems, climate, mental health and well-being. And for others, people have other goals in alignment with their foundations or their philanthropic funds, also known as DAFs, donor-advised funds. But to have those funds just sitting in the Dow or the S&P or, maybe other particular stocks and bonds or things that are just not as aligned with the vision doesn't make any sense to me, because that capital is not being put to work towards the vision and the mission. So I think for me, it's, this is it's an experiment and it's difficult and it's not exactly easy. I just came from a philanthropic, a gathering where there was a lot of push and pull on how to do this. But, I try to be investing through our philanthropic funds, so that if I want it to be profitable, it should be a profitable social impact business. And then those profits will go right back into the philanthropic funds and continue to grow and add to the grant making that we're able to do. But you can't invest the entire fund, because then you would that's not the purpose of it. The purpose of it is to be, the primary purpose, I think, is to be getting grants out to nonprofits that want to put it to work today.
Yeah, when I moved to New Zealand, I kept hearing this term that I never used to hear in the States, fit for purpose. And I've come to really appreciate it because, in this context, like there's certain types of business models that are fit for purpose in a for-profit entity structure that might be able to raise investment early, share dividends, have profit, et cetera. And then there's certain types of activities that need to be subsidized because the current system is, for whatever reason, externalizing certain costs and needs to be subsidized back in through something like philanthropic grant making or through something like government grant making and funding. And, the binary delineation between for-profit and nonprofit, I don't think serves us very well, even though we keep needing to be forced to deal with it, partly because of the way that all the rules are encoded and the incentive structures and so forth. But I do think that there's, a light that does need to be shined on this fact that, within donor advised funds, for example, you have billions and billions and billions and billions of dollars, and yet, less than 5% of it, roughly, per annum going to grant making. So we can all feel great about our total nonprofit dollars, but the reality is, it's like you said, it's Dow Jones, S&P, government bonds, oil companies, et cetera, that are being funded with not just the majority, but the vast majority of all of those dollars. So can we move that large pool of capital into more for-purpose structures and vehicles, things that are more in service to the world? And my impression is that that's a lot of what Unreasonable is doing.
Yeah. So maybe I'll talk first about the donor advised funds. I think one of the challenges is that money is aggregated, but it's actually lots of little funds. And so none of them have like somebody in charge of directing the entire corpus with particular goals. And so when money tends to be passive, people put it in more passive vehicles. And so I think the donor advised funds need to do better at offering better products to their clients and making sure that they know that they're available. And I hope to see a lot more of that coming out soon. I think also there's not a lot of great liquid investments in the impact space. So when you do decide that you want to put your investment dollars into something that is aligned with social and environmental values, that often can be kind of high risk and locking up your capital for 8 to 10 to infinity years. Right. And so then that prevents grant making. And so I would like for people to create more options for places to park cash that is aligned with the world we'd like to create, but that is also liquid for grant making.
And on that point, I do think this is going to be a real area for crypto, because the tokenization of different asset classes allows for liquidity to happen. And we have to figure out the securities regulations and so forth first. But, the reality is, I think this is one of the characteristics or properties of crypto in terms of making things much more liquid and much more tradable. Because we saw the same issue in our philanthropic experience where we wanted to get behind an impact fund, but it's like, you got to lock up your money for 10 years. And even then it's no guarantee. And you're like, well, but we want to keep it for grant making. We're not really sure that we can't forecast the future of where we're going to be in 10 years. And so it's difficult.
It is. And also like, if you and I are young, and we are young in, philanthropists.
Thanks.
I don't know. I like to think of it as young. 40, 41.
Not as much as we used to be.
I know. But there's this big question about like, do you try to do all the grant making now, or do you try to spread it out over a lifetime, right? And like, how do you do that? How do you manage your philanthropic funds? Because there's so much urgency now, but also there will always be urgency. So, you could argue like, well, it's kind of my duty as an activist to get the highest returns possible so that I could, put it into grant making. But then I put on my activist investor hat and I say, well, wow, if I want the highest returns possible, I might have to make some ethical negotiations here. And you're like, well, which one do you do, right? And so that's why I think there's a diversified portfolio approach where you have some of the funds you're going to say, this is such an important purposeful venture that we need to launch into the world that I'm willing to take lower returns, but I know that's going to be less money for my philanthropic giving.
Right.
But it's going to be of social service to the whole. And sometimes where you want to say, like, I want to try to, maximize returns as much as I can. So, our philosophy at Unreasonable is that, in order to create the world that we all want to live in, that is a beautiful, regenerative world where we're all nourished and where we all flourish. Let's say this, in a world in which we are all flourishing, the companies that are needed to create that future will be the most profitable companies of the future because they're going to solve all the big problems of today. And so we're actually trying to find those companies, and we're what you would call maybe an accelerator is that we find these companies that are working in the green economy. They might be working in education. They might be working in, fields that are important for public health, or we have a program on the Sustainable Development Goals, for example. We find them and we help accelerate their growth. And up until now, we have not invested in them at all. We just have created a network and a platform to help surround them with investors and supporters and mentorship and all the kinds of resources that they need to become the great companies of tomorrow. So we'd love to see all the Fortune 500 companies of tomorrow be social environmental impact companies. And when you meet these, we call them fellows, but when you meet these entrepreneurs, we want these guys with the consciousness that they're holding, with the values that they're holding, we want them to be the leaders of our economy in the future. And we want to do everything in our power to help them succeed. And we also believe that is going to be extremely profitable because of the success that these companies are going to have. And so for that reason, after all these years, we are going to eventually create this fund to help people. Right now, we have a syndicate. So if people want to invest directly in the companies, we aggregate people to special purpose vehicles so that they can invest in the companies when the deals come about. And then we're going to create a fund. And we looked at a tokenized fund a few years ago of trying to figure out how to do this. And if there is the ability to do that in the future and someone can help us figure that out, we would probably love to do that.
Nice. Amazing. Well, there's so many different threads here. It's such a privilege to share the time and space and to talk to you, Christiana. And I know you're at the cusp of a new chapter and journey, which I hope that we can have another conversation and talk about what you're learning and embarking on in the world of mental health and well-being. But yes, thanks for sharing so much of your time with us already. Any last messages? And we will make sure to put in the show notes, links to all of these different projects and so forth. But anything else you'd like to end with?
Just gratitude for everybody filming this and putting this together. Gratitude for you for bringing these conversations, which, maybe you and I are move between worlds. So we have access to, and bringing this and making it available to everyone free online. I think it's very important. I look forward to learning from all the other people that you are learning from.
Amazing. Thank you.
Thanks, Matthew.
All right. What'd you think? As I reflected on this conversation, I kept coming back to the point Christiana made about the plurality of approaches and the coexistence of different methodologies, of whether it's the more tech-driven lens, things like lab-based meats, or whether it's more of a local and regenerative emphasis on how we grow our food, and the criticality of price in determining how people get access to food now and in the future. I love how Christiana just puts herself into the field and into the research firsthand. To learn more, you can go to flourishtrust.org. You might also be interested in the conversation we had with Kimball Musk from Big Green. Links are in the show notes. You can find all of our conversations and more at maearth.com. Thanks for tuning in. We'll see you on the next one.